It was a quiet afternoon, the kind that feels like it could last forever. 10-year-old Lara sat in the back seat of her mother's car, clutching her favorite stuffed bunny, Mr. Fluff. Her mother, Isabel, hummed softly as she drove, the sound warm and comforting. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the road ahead. But beneath the surface of this peaceful moment, something was wrong, very wrong. Without warning, the car lurched. Isabel's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her face a mask of panic. "Lara, hold on," she shouted, her voice trembling. But the brakes didn't respond. The car swerved off the road, crashing into a tree with a deafening crunch. The world went black. When Lara opened her eyes, she was lying on the ground, dazed and bruised. Smoke rose from the wreckage of the car, and the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. She tried to stand, but her legs wobbled. "Mom? Mom, where are you?" she called out, her voice shaking. She stumbled toward the car and saw her mother, unconscious and bleeding. Lara's small hands trembled as she tried to wake her up, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, please wake up, please." But Isabel didn't respond. The paramedics arrived and pulled Lara away from the scene as they worked to save her mother. Lara watched in horror, clutching Mr. Fluff tightly, as her mother was loaded into an ambulance. The ride to the hospital was a blur, the sirens wailing like a mournful cry. At the hospital, Lara sat alone in the waiting room, her knees pulled up to her chest. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of antiseptic filled the air. Her father, Victor, arrived, his face unreadable. He didn't hug her or ask if she was okay. Instead, he sat down next to her and said in a cold, detached tone, "Your mother, she didn't make it." Lara's world shattered. She began to cry, but Victor didn't comfort her. He just sat there, staring at the wall, as if lost in his own thoughts. That night, Lara was back at home, but the house felt empty and cold. She sat on the couch, hugging Mr. Fluff, her mind replaying the accident over and over. She remembered something strange. The night before the crash, she had overheard her father talking to someone on the phone. His words echoed in her mind. "The plan is set. Once the insurance money comes through, we'll be free of this mess." At the time, Lara hadn't understood what it meant. But now, it sent a chill down her spine. Unable to sleep, Lara sneaked into her mother's room. She opened the drawer of the nightstand, looking for something, anything, that might help her make sense of what had happened. Her small hands trembled as she found a folded piece of paper hidden beneath a stack of old photos. She unfolded it and saw her mother's handwriting, hurried and shaky. "Be careful, Lara. Victor isn't who he says he is." Lara's heart raced. What did it mean? And why had her mother hidden this note? As she stood there, clutching the paper, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Victor's voice called out, sharp and impatient. "Lara, what are you doing in there?" She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The note felt heavy in her hands, like a secret too big for a 10-year-old to carry. But one thing was clear. Her mother had been trying to warn her about something, and Lara was determined to find out what it was. The morning after the accident, the house felt colder than ever. Lara sat at the kitchen table, pushing around a bowl of cereal she had no appetite to eat. Victor was in the living room, talking on the phone in a low, urgent voice. Lara couldn't make out the words, but his tone made her uneasy. She clutched Mr. Fluff tightly, her mind still replaying her mother's note. "Be careful, Lara. Victor isn't who he says he is." The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the silence. Lara peeked out the window and saw her grandmother, Jessica, stepping out of a taxi. Her heart leaped. Jessica was the only person who had always made her feel safe, the only one who could fill the void her mother had left. Victor's voice cut through the room, sharp and annoyed. "What is she doing here?" he muttered, more to himself than to Lara. He walked to the door and opened it just as Jessica reached the porch. "Victor," Jessica said, her voice steady but laced with concern. "I came as soon as I heard. Where's Lara?" Victor blocked the doorway, his expression cold. She's fine. You didn't need to come. Jessica's eyes narrowed. She just lost her mother, Victor. She needs family right now. Without waiting for his response, she stepped past him and into the house. Her eyes immediately found Lara, who was still sitting at the kitchen table, looking small and fragile. "Oh, sweetheart," Jessica said, her voice softening. She rushed to Lara and wrapped her in a tight embrace. Lara buried her face in her grandmother's shoulder, finally letting herself cry. Jessica held her, stroking her hair and whispering, "It's going to be okay. My love, I'm here now." Victor watched from the doorway, his jaw clenched. "She's fine," he repeated, his tone dismissive. "She doesn't need you coddling her." Jessica shot him a sharp look. "She's a child, Victor. She needs love and support, not whatever this is." She gestured to the cold, lifeless house, her voice tinged with anger. Victor didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Jessica sighed and knelt down to meet Lara at eye level. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Lara hesitated. She wanted to tell Jessica everything. About the note, about Victor's strange behavior, about the accident that didn't feel like an accident. But she was afraid. What if Victor overheard? What if he got angry? Instead, she just nodded and whispered, "I'm okay, Grandma." Jessica studied her granddaughter's face, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. "You don't have to be brave all the time, Lara. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to ask for help." Lara looked down at her hands, still clutching Mr. Fluff. "I miss Mom," she said quietly. Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled softly. "I miss her too, sweetheart, more than anything. But we'll get through this together, okay? You and me." Later that evening, after Lara had gone to bed, Jessica sat in the living room, her mind racing. Something about Victor's behavior didn't sit right with her. He had always been distant, but now he seemed calculating. She thought about the way he had dismissed her, the way he had barely acknowledged Lara's grief. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. Quietly, Jessica began to look around the house, searching for clues. She started in the kitchen, opening drawers and cabinets, but found nothing unusual. Then she moved to Victor's study, a room she had always been told was off-limits. The door was slightly ajar, and she slipped inside. The room was cluttered, with papers scattered across the desk and shelves filled with books and files. Jessica's eyes landed on a stack of documents near the edge of the desk. She picked them up and began to read, her heart sinking with each word. They were financial records, showing that Victor had been in deep debt for months. And then she saw it. A life insurance policy, taken out in Isabel's name just weeks before the accident. Jessica's hands trembled as she held the papers. This couldn't be a coincidence. Could Victor have? She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. But one thing was clear. Lara wasn't safe here. Not with Victor. The next morning, Jessica sat down with Lara at the kitchen table. Victor was nowhere to be seen, and the house was eerily quiet. "Lara," Jessica began, her voice gentle but serious, "I need you to tell me the truth. Has your father been different since the accident?" Lara hesitated, her eyes darting toward the hallway. She wanted to tell Jessica everything, but she was scared. What if Victor found out? What if he got angry? But then she remembered her mother's note, hidden under her pillow. Her mother had trusted Jessica. Maybe she could too. "Grandma," Lara whispered, her voice barely audible, I think Dad did something bad." Jessica's heart sank, but she kept her expression calm. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Lara took a deep breath and told Jessica about the note, about the phone call she had overheard, about the way Victor had acted since the accident. Jessica listened, her face growing paler with each word. When Lara finished, Jessica reached out and took her hand. "You're very brave for telling me this, Lara, and I promise you, I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe." But before Jessica could say more, the sound of the front door opening made them both freeze. Victor walked in, his eyes narrowing as he saw them sitting together. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice cold. Jessica stood, her expression firm. "We need to talk, Victor. About Lara. About Isabel. About everything." Victor's face darkened, but before he could respond, Lara spoke up, her voice trembling but determined. "Dad, I know what you did." The room fell silent. Victor's eyes flicked between Lara and Jessica, his expression unreadable. For a moment, no one moved. Then Victor took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know anything, Lara. And you," he said, turning to Jessica, "need to stay out of this." Jessica stepped in front of Lara, shielding her. "This isn't over, Victor. Not by a long shot." The tension in the house was palpable after Jessica's confrontation with Victor. He had stormed out, slamming the door behind him, leaving Lara and Jessica alone in the kitchen. Lara's hands were still shaking, and Jessica could see the fear in her granddaughter's eyes. She knelt down and took Lara's hands in hers. "Listen to me, sweetheart," Jessica said, her voice steady but gentle. "We're going to figure this out, but we need to be careful. Your father, he's not the man we thought he was. Do you understand?" Lara nodded, though her lower lip trembled. "I'm scared, Grandma." Jessica pulled her into a tight hug. "I know, my love, but you're not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you." That afternoon, Jessica decided it was time to dig deeper. She knew Victor was hiding something, and she was determined to find out what it was. She started by searching the house for any clues that might shed light on Isabel's death or Victor's true intentions. Lara followed her, clutching Mr. Fluff tightly, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. They began in Isabel's room, the place where Lara had found the note. Jessica opened drawers and sifted through papers, looking for anything that might connect Victor to the accident. Lara sat on the bed, watching her grandmother work, her mind racing with questions. "Grandma," Lara said quietly, "what are we looking for?" Jessica paused and looked at her. "Anything that might tell us what really happened to your mom. Anything that might prove your father was involved." Lara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what that meant. She reached under her pillow and pulled out the note her mother had left. "This is all I found," she said, handing it to Jessica. Jessica read the note, her expression growing more serious with each word. "This is important, Lara," she said. "Your mother was trying to warn you. She knew something was wrong." As they continued to search, Lara's eyes landed on a small, dusty box tucked under the bed. She pulled it out and opened it, revealing a collection of old photos and letters. One photo caught her eye. It was of her mother and a man Lara didn't recognize. They were standing in front of a mechanic's garage, and Isabel was smiling, but the man looked serious, almost nervous. "Grandma, look at this," Lara said, holding up the photo. Jessica took it and studied it closely. "This man, I think he's the mechanic who worked on your mom's car. His name was Tom, I think. Your mom mentioned him once." Lara's eyes widened. "Do you think he knows something about the accident?" Jessica nodded slowly. "It's possible. If we can find him, he might be able to tell us what really happened." Just as they were about to leave the room, they heard the sound of the front door opening. Victor was back. Jessica quickly put the photo in her pocket and motioned for Lara to stay quiet. They listened as Victor's footsteps echoed through the house, growing closer. "Lara," Victor called, his voice sharp. "Where are you?" Lara froze, her heart pounding. Jessica placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Stay here. I'll handle this." Jessica stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her. Victor was standing at the top of the stairs, his eyes narrowed. "What are you doing in there?" he demanded. "Just helping Lara clean up," Jessica replied, her tone calm but firm. "She's been through a lot, Victor. She needs support." Victor's jaw tightened. "She's fine, and I don't need you meddling in our lives." Jessica crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "This isn't about meddling, Victor. This is about Lara's safety. And if you have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't have a problem with me being here." Victor's eyes flicked toward the closed door, and for a moment, Lara thought he might burst in. But instead, he turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. That night, after Victor had gone to bed, Jessica and Lara sat in the kitchen, whispering quietly. Jessica had the photo of the mechanic spread out on the table, along with the note Lara had found. "We need to find this man," Jessica said, pointing to the photo. "If he knows something about the accident, he might be the key to proving what really happened." Lara nodded, though she looked nervous. "What if Dad finds out we're looking for him?" Jessica reached out and took Lara's hand. "We'll be careful, sweetheart. But we can't let fear stop us. Your mother deserves justice, and you deserve to know the truth." The next morning, Jessica and Lara set out to find the mechanic. They drove to the garage where the photo had been taken, but when they arrived, they found it abandoned, the windows boarded up and the sign faded. Jessica knocked on the door, but there was no answer. "He's not here," Lara said, her voice tinged with disappointment. Jessica frowned, but she wasn't ready to give up. "Let's ask around. Someone might know where he went." They spent the next few hours talking to people in the neighborhood, but no one seemed to know where Tom had gone. Just as they were about to leave, an elderly man sitting on a porch called out to them. "You looking for Tom?" he asked. Jessica nodded. "Yes. Do you know where he is?" The man shook his head. "Haven't seen him in weeks, but I heard he got into some trouble. Something about a car accident. He skipped town after that." Jessica's heart sank. "Do you know where he went?" The man shrugged. "No idea. But if you find him, tell him he still owes me money." As they drove back home, Lara looked out the window, her mind racing. "What do we do now, Grandma?" she asked. Jessica sighed, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "We keep looking. We can't give up, Lara. Not now." The days following their failed attempt to find the mechanic were tense. Victor's behavior grew more erratic, his coldness turning into something darker. He watched Jessica and Lara closely, his eyes narrowing whenever they whispered to each other or left the house together. Lara could feel his suspicion like a shadow following her everywhere she went. One evening, after dinner, Victor cornered Jessica in the kitchen. His voice was low, but Lara could hear the anger simmering beneath his words. "You need to stop filling Lara's head with nonsense," he said, his tone sharp. "She's my daughter, and I won't have you turning her against me." Jessica stood her ground, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not turning her against you, Victor, but she deserves to know the truth. And if you have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't be so defensive." Victor's face flushed with anger, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, slamming the door to his study behind him. Lara, who had been listening from the hallway, felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She knew Victor was dangerous, and she could sense that things were about to escalate. That night, Lara lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts of her mother, the accident, and the note she had found. She reached under her pillow and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper, reading it again in the dim light of her bedside lamp. "Be careful, Lara. Victor isn't who he says he is." As she stared at the words, she heard a noise outside her door. She froze, her heart pounding. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door creaked open. Victor stood in the doorway, his silhouette looming in the darkness. "Lara," he said, his voice low and menacing. "What are you doing awake?" Lara quickly shoved the note under her pillow and sat up, trying to steady her breathing. "I couldn't sleep," she stammered. Victor stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the space. "You've been spending a lot of time with your grandmother," he said, his tone accusatory. "What has she been telling you?" Lara shook her head, her voice trembling. "Nothing, Dad. We've just been talking about Mom." Victor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Lara thought he might press further. But then he sighed and turned to leave. "Get some sleep," he said curtly, "and stay out of things that don't concern you." When he was gone, Lara let out a shaky breath. She knew she couldn't stay here any longer. Victor was getting more suspicious, and she didn't know how much longer she and Jessica could keep up the charade. The next morning, Jessica found Lara in the kitchen, her face pale and her hands trembling. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Jessica asked, her voice filled with concern. Lara looked up at her grandmother, tears welling in her eyes. "He knows, Grandma. He knows we're looking into Mom's accident. I don't think we're safe here anymore." Jessica's expression hardened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it from Lara made it all too real. "We need to leave," she said firmly. "Today. Before he does something we can't undo." Lara nodded, her heart racing. "Where will we go?" Jessica thought for a moment, then said, "I have a friend who lives a few hours away. She has a cabin in the woods. It's secluded, and Victor won't know where to find us. We'll be safe there." They packed quickly and quietly, taking only the essentials. Lara grabbed Mr. Fluff and the note from her mother, tucking them into her backpack. Jessica filled a bag with clothes, food, and a few other supplies. They moved swiftly, knowing they didn't have much time before Victor returned. Just as they were about to leave, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made them freeze. Jessica peeked out the window and saw Victor stepping out of his car, his face dark with anger. "He's back," Jessica whispered, her voice urgent. "We need to go. Now." They slipped out the back door and ran toward the woods behind the house. Lara's heart pounded as she followed Jessica, her legs burning with the effort. They didn't stop until they reached a small clearing, where Jessica's car was parked, hidden behind a cluster of trees. "Get in," Jessica said, her voice low but firm. Lara climbed into the passenger seat, clutching her backpack tightly. Jessica started the engine and drove down a narrow dirt road, away from the house and away from Victor. As they drove, Lara looked out the window, her mind racing. She couldn't believe they were running away, but she knew it was the only way to stay safe. She glanced at Jessica, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly, her eyes focused on the road. "Grandma," Lara said quietly, "what if he finds us?" Jessica reached over and took Lara's hand. "He won't, sweetheart. We're going to be careful, and we're going to figure this out together." Lara nodded, but the fear still lingered. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't trust Victor. Not anymore. The cabin in the woods was small and rustic, but it felt like a sanctuary after the chaos they had left behind. Jessica and Lara spent the first day settling in, unpacking their meager supplies and making the space as comfortable as possible. The quiet of the forest was a stark contrast to the tension-filled house they had escaped, but Lara couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was still out there, searching for them. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Jessica turned to Lara with a serious expression. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said. "We can't stay here forever. Eventually, we'll have to face Victor and make sure he can't hurt us, or anyone else, ever again." Lara nodded, though the thought made her stomach churn. "What do we do, Grandma? We don't have any proof." Jessica sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We need to find that mechanic, Tom. He's the key to all of this. If we can get him to talk, we might be able to prove that Victor was involved in your mother's accident." Lara's eyes widened. "But how? We don't even know where he is." Jessica leaned forward, her voice low but determined. "I've been thinking about that. Before we left, I made a few calls. I have a friend who's a private investigator. He's looking into Tom's whereabouts. If anyone can find him, it's him." The next morning, Jessica's phone rang. She answered quickly, her heart racing. Lara watched as her grandmother's expression shifted from hope to relief. "He found him," Jessica said after hanging up. "Tom's been hiding in a small town about 3 hours from here. My friend says he's been laying low, but he's willing to talk, for the right price." Lara's eyes lit up. "We have to go see him." Jessica nodded. "We will, but we need to be careful. If Victor is watching us, he might follow us there." They left the cabin early the next day, driving through winding back roads to avoid being spotted. The journey was tense, with Lara constantly checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Victor's car behind them. But they arrived at the small town without incident, pulling up to a rundown motel on the outskirts. Tom was waiting for them in a dimly lit room, his face gaunt and his eyes darting nervously. He looked like a man who had been running for a long time. "You're Jessica, right?" he asked, his voice shaky. "And this must be Lara." Jessica nodded, her expression stern. "We need to know what happened to Isabel, and we need to know what Victor's role in it was." Tom hesitated, glancing at Lara. "I don't know if I should be talking about this in front of her." Lara stepped forward, her voice firm despite her fear. "I deserve to know the truth. My mom. She deserves justice." Tom sighed, running a hand over his face. "All right, but you're not going to like what you hear." He began to recount the events leading up to the accident. Victor had approached him months earlier, asking him to tamper with Isabel's car. At first, Tom had refused, but Victor had threatened him, saying he would ruin his business if he didn't comply. Desperate and afraid, Tom had agreed. "I didn't think he'd actually go through with it," Tom said, his voice filled with regret. "I thought he was just trying to scare her. But then, the accident happened, and I knew I'd made a terrible mistake." Lara's heart sank as she listened, tears streaming down her face. Her worst fears had been confirmed. Victor had planned the accident. He had killed her mother. Jessica's voice was cold as she spoke. "We need you to come forward, Tom. We need you to tell the police what you just told us." Tom shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I can't. Victor will kill me if I do." Jessica leaned in, her gaze unwavering. "If you don't, he'll keep getting away with it. And he'll keep hurting people. You have a chance to make this right." Tom hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll do it. But you have to protect me." As they left the motel, Lara felt a mix of emotions: relief, anger, and a deep, aching sadness. They had the truth, but it came at a cost. Her father was a monster, and her mother was gone because of him. But before they could make it back to the car, a familiar voice called out from the shadows. Well, what do we have here?" Lara froze, her blood running cold. Victor stepped into the light, his face twisted with anger. He had found them. Victor stood in the dim light of the motel parking lot, his eyes blazing with anger. Jessica instinctively stepped in front of Lara, shielding her from his menacing gaze. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, no one spoke. "Victor," Jessica said, her voice steady but firm. "This ends now. We know what you did." Victor's lips curled into a sneer. "You don't know anything, Jessica. You're just a meddling old woman who's in way over her head." Lara, trembling but determined, stepped out from behind her grandmother. "We know you killed Mom," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Tom told us everything." Victor's expression darkened, and for a moment, Lara thought he might lunge at them. But instead, he laughed. A cold, hollow sound that sent chills down her spine. "Tom's a coward," he said. "He'll say anything to save himself. But you're just a child. You don't understand how the world works." Jessica tightened her grip on Lara's hand. "We understand enough, Victor, and we're not going to let you get away with this." Victor's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing without me. Lara is my daughter, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect her." "Protect her?" Jessica shot back, her voice rising. "You've done nothing but hurt her since Isabel died. You're not protecting her. You're destroying her." Victor's face twisted with rage, and he lunged forward, grabbing Jessica by the arm. "You're not taking her from me," he shouted. Lara screamed, her fear turning to anger. She grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at Victor, hitting him in the shoulder. He stumbled back, releasing Jessica, and turned his fury on Lara. "You little—" he started. But before he could finish, the sound of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed as police cars pulled into the parking lot, surrounding them. Victor froze, his face pale. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Jessica stepped forward, her voice strong and clear. "This is justice, Victor. I called the police before we came here. They've been listening to everything." Victor's eyes widened in panic as officers approached, their hands on their weapons. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm her father. You can't take her from me." One of the officers stepped forward, his tone firm. "Victor, you're under arrest for the murder of Isabel Martinez and the attempted coercion of Thomas Green. You have the right to remain silent." As the officer continued reading Victor his rights, Lara watched in stunned silence. Her father, the man she had once trusted, was being handcuffed and led away. She felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. Jessica knelt down beside her, wrapping her in a tight embrace. "It's over, sweetheart," she whispered. "You're safe now." The days that followed were a blur. Victor was taken into custody, and the police began a full investigation into Isabel's death. Tom, true to his word, came forward with his testimony, providing the evidence needed to ensure Victor would face justice, and was considered coerced, so he also had his sentence, but it was reduced. Lara and Jessica returned to the cabin, where they began to rebuild their lives. The weight of the past still lingered, but for the first time in months, Lara felt a sense of peace. She knew her mother would never come back, but she also knew that her memory would live on. Not as a victim, but as a woman who had loved her daughter deeply and had tried to protect her until the very end. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Jessica turned to Lara with a soft smile. "You've been so brave through all of this," she said. "Your mother would be so proud of you." Lara looked up at her grandmother, her eyes filled with tears. "I just wish she could be here." Jessica reached out and took Lara's hand. "She is here, sweetheart, in your heart, and she always will be." Love a good story? Hit subscribe and let's embrace every twist together. Heartfelt stories are just a click away.